Kevin Walsh stood at the observation window of Petra Station, his coffee growing cold in his hand. The morning had started like any other on this remote research outpost, perched high in the craggy peaks of Vindara Prime. He was supposed to be cataloging mineral samples today, routine work for a xenobiologist stationed alone on the edge of charted space. But the readings on his atmospheric scanner had changed everything. Something large was moving through the upper atmosphere. Multiple somethings, actually. The scanner showed 12 distinct heat signatures, each one massive, descending from the frozen peaks to the north. Kevin set down his coffee and leaned closer to the monitor, his heart beginning to race. Nothing that big should be flying in this region. The local wildlife consisted mostly of small cliff dwellers and hardy mountain insects. These signatures were different. These were enormous. He rushed to the external cameras and switched them to maximum zoom. For a moment he saw nothing but the usual gray sky and snow-covered ridges. Then they emerged from the clouds and Kevin felt his breath catch in his throat. Dragons. 12 of them, moving in a loose formation like a flock of birds. But these were not the common fire drakes that occasionally passed through the lower valleys. These dragons were pure white, their scales gleaming like fresh snow even in the dim morning light. Albino dragons. Kevin had seen pictures in ancient texts, read the old exploration logs, but every scientific record declared them extinct. The last confirmed sighting was over 200 years ago. Yet here they were, real and alive, gliding toward his station on massive wings that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly glow. Kevin activated every external camera, his hands shaking as he recorded what might be the discovery of his career. The dragons were magnificent, each one at least 20 meters from nose to tail, with horns that curved back from their heads like crowns of ivory. But as they drew closer, Kevin noticed something wrong. The dragons looked thin, their movements lacking the powerful grace described in historical accounts. Their scales, which should have gleamed brilliantly, appeared dull and lifeless. These creatures were starving. They were desperate. The herd circled the station once, twice, 3 times. Kevin watched them through the cameras, his mind racing. Dragons were intelligent, everyone knew that, but they typically avoided human settlements. They were proud creatures, solitary hunters who valued their independence. For an entire herd to approach a human outpost like this meant something was seriously wrong. One dragon, slightly larger than the others and with longer horns, broke from the circle and descended toward the main landing pad. This had to be the matriarch, the leader of the herd. She landed with surprising gentleness, her claws barely scraping the metal surface. Then she did something Kevin had never seen in any dragon footage. She lowered her head and waited. It was a gesture of peace. A request. Kevin's training told him to stay inside, to observe from safety, to call for backup before making contact with unknown species. But his instinct, the part of him that had spent years studying animal behavior across a dozen worlds, told him something different. This dragon was asking for help. Kevin moved to the airlock, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He pulled on his thermal jacket but left his stunner in its wall mount. If he was going to do this, he had to show trust. Weapons would send the wrong message. The outer door hissed open and cold mountain air rushed in, stinging his face. Kevin stepped onto the landing pad, his boots crunching on the thin layer of ice. The matriarch was 10 meters away, massive and powerful, but she remained perfectly still. Her eyes, large and golden, watched him with an intensity that made him feel like she was looking into his very soul. Kevin raised his hands slowly, palms out, showing he carried nothing. He took one step forward, then another. The matriarch's nostrils flared, scenting him, but she did not move away. Around the station, the other 11 dragons landed, forming a loose semicircle. They were watching, waiting to see what their leader would do. 3 smaller dragons, juveniles by their size, huddled close to the matriarch. Kevin could see them clearly now, and his stomach tightened with concern. The young ones were sick. Crystal-like formations covered patches of their white scales, spreading across their bodies like some kind of aggressive mineral growth. The crystals were dark purple, pulsing faintly with an internal light. Whatever this was, it was not natural. The juveniles trembled, their breathing labored and raspy. One of them, the smallest, could barely keep its head up. Kevin had seen parasitic infections before, mineral-based diseases that attacked silicon-based life forms, but never anything quite like this. These dragons needed help and they needed it soon. Kevin took another step closer. He was now within reach of the matriarch, close enough that she could kill him with a single swipe of her claws. But she remained still, her golden eyes never leaving his face. Slowly, carefully, Kevin knelt down, making himself smaller, less threatening. It was a risk, putting himself in such a vulnerable position, but it was also a sign of respect. The matriarch made a sound, a low rumble that vibrated through Kevin's chest. It was not aggressive. It sounded almost like a purr, though deeper and more complex. She turned her massive head toward the sick juveniles, then back to Kevin. The message was clear. She was asking him to look at them. She was asking him to help. Kevin moved slowly toward the nearest juvenile, a young dragon whose scales were more than half covered with the purple crystals. The matriarch shifted, positioning herself between Kevin and the other adults, making it clear that she was permitting this. The juvenile watched Kevin approach with wide, frightened eyes, but it did not pull away. Up close, the crystals looked even worse. They seemed to be growing out of the dragon's scales, penetrating deep into the tissue beneath. Kevin could see small cracks in the formations where the dragon's body was trying to reject them, but the crystals just kept spreading. Without treatment, these juveniles would die. It might take weeks, maybe months, but the outcome was certain. Kevin reached out slowly and touched the edge of one crystal formation. The juvenile flinched but held still, trusting the matriarch's judgment. The crystal was hard, almost like volcanic glass, and warm to the touch. It was feeding off the dragon's body heat, growing stronger as it drained the life from its host. The matriarch made another sound, this one higher pitched, almost questioning. Kevin looked up at her and saw something in those golden eyes that made his chest ache. It was hope. Desperate, fragile hope. This ancient creature, this being from a species thought lost to time, was placing her trust in him. She had brought her herd, her sick children, to a human because she believed he could help them. Kevin stood up and met the matriarch's gaze. He did not know if she could understand his words, but he spoke anyway. His voice was steady despite the fear and awe churning inside him. He told her he would try. He told her he would do everything in his power to save her young ones. And somehow, looking into those intelligent eyes, Kevin believed she understood. The matriarch lowered her great head until her snout nearly touched Kevin's chest. It was a gesture of trust, of acceptance. Around the landing pad, the other dragons settled into resting positions, their wings folding against their sides. They were staying. They were waiting. They had placed their faith in a human, against all odds, against centuries of separation and silence. Kevin turned back toward the station, his mind already racing with possibilities. He had medical supplies, analysis equipment, a full xenobiology lab. He did not know if he could cure this infection, but he had to try. 12 albino dragons had sought him out, had trusted him with their most precious members. He could not let them down. As he walked back to the airlock, Kevin glanced over his shoulder one more time. The matriarch watched him go, her juveniles pressed close to her side, and in that moment, Kevin understood that everything had changed. This was no longer just a research posting on a remote world. This was a chance to forge a bond between species, to prove that trust and compassion could bridge any divide. He had work to do. Kevin worked through the night, his laboratory illuminated by the soft blue glow of analysis screens. The tissue sample from the smallest juvenile sat in the scanner, magnified 10,000 times on the monitor before him. What he saw made his jaw tighten with anger and concern. The purple crystals were not crystals at all. They were colonies of parasitic organisms, microscopic creatures that bonded together to form the hard, glass-like structures he had seen on the young dragons. Each organism was feeding on the dragon's cellular structure, breaking down healthy tissue and replacing it with their own mineral-based bodies. It was brutal and efficient, a perfect parasite designed to slowly consume its host. But where had these parasites come from? Kevin ran the sample through his database, cross-referencing every known organism in this sector of space. The computer worked for 20 minutes before producing a match. The parasites were native to deep underground water systems, typically found in cave networks far below the surface. They normally fed on mineral deposits and were harmless to surface-dwelling creatures. They should never have been in the mountain streams where dragons drank. Kevin pulled up geological surveys of the region, his fingers flying across the keyboard. There. 15 kilometers upstream from the dragon nesting grounds, a new mining operation had been established 4 months ago. The company was listed as Vreckland Corporation, a mid-sized outfit with a history of cutting corners and ignoring environmental regulations. They were drilling deep into the mountain, extracting rare metals from the ancient rock. The timeline matched perfectly. 4 months ago the drilling began. 3 months ago, according to the medical scans Kevin had taken, the first juvenile started showing symptoms. The mining operation was pumping contaminated water up from deep underground caves, water filled with these parasites, and dumping it back into the mountain streams. The dragons had been drinking poison for months. A sound from outside pulled Kevin from his research. He looked through the window and saw the matriarch standing near the cargo bay door, her massive head tilted to one side. She was holding something in her mouth, carefully, like a cat carrying a kitten. Kevin saved his work and headed outside. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. The matriarch lowered her head as Kevin approached, opening her jaws to reveal a bundle of plants. Mountain herbs, their roots still covered in soil. She placed them gently on the ground in front of Kevin, then stepped back, waiting. Kevin knelt down and examined the plants. He recognized some of them from his botanical database. Silverleaf, known for its anti-inflammatory properties. Stonewort, used by many species to treat digestive problems. Frost bloom, a rare flower that grew only in the highest peaks, valued for its ability to boost immune systems. The dragons had been trying to cure the infection themselves, gathering medicine from across the mountains. The matriarch made a low sound, almost like a sigh. Kevin looked up at her and saw something remarkable in her golden eyes. Frustration. Sadness. She had tried to save her young ones with everything she knew, and it had not been enough. That was why she had come to him. Not because dragons were weak, but because they had exhausted every option they had. Over the next hour, more dragons came forward, each bringing plants they had gathered. Some brought roots, others brought flowers or strips of bark. They laid them all out in neat rows, organizing them by type without any instruction from Kevin. It was deliberate, intelligent, purposeful. These creatures were not simple animals. They were thinking, reasoning beings with their own medical knowledge passed down through generations. Kevin began to understand their system of communication by watching them interact. The matriarch would make a particular sound, low and rolling, and the other dragons would respond by shifting positions. A sharp chirp meant danger or warning. A soft hum indicated contentment or agreement. When showing Kevin plants, they would tap their claws in specific patterns, 1 tap for plants they tried recently, 2 taps for plants that showed some effect, 3 taps for plants that made things worse. He started responding with his own gestures, pointing to the sick juveniles and then to his laboratory, trying to convey that he needed to work inside. The matriarch watched his movements carefully, her eyes tracking every motion. Then she did something that made Kevin's heart skip a beat. She mimicked his gesture, pointing with one long claw toward the juveniles and then toward the lab. She understood. She was communicating back. For the next 2 days, Kevin and the dragons worked together in a strange but effective partnership. Kevin would show them diagrams of the parasites on his data pad, and the matriarch would study them with intense focus. He would point to different parts of the dragon's body, and she would make specific sounds that he began to recognize as words. The sound for wing was different from the sound for leg, which was different from the sound for tail. They had language. They had names for things. The juveniles were moved into the cargo bay, which Kevin had converted into a makeshift medical ward. The adult dragons were too large to fit inside, but they gathered around the exterior windows, watching every procedure. Kevin felt their eyes on him constantly, felt the weight of their trust and their fear. If he failed, if the juveniles died, he did not know what would happen. But he could not think about that. He had to focus on finding a cure. On the 3rd morning, Kevin knew he had to contact someone. He could not do this alone. The parasites were aggressive, and his medical supplies were limited. He needed help, needed resources, needed official intervention to shut down the mining operation before more dragons got sick. He opened a communication channel to the Galactic Conservation Authority, the organization responsible for protecting endangered species across settled space. The connection took 15 minutes to establish, routed through 3 different relay stations before finally reaching a bored-looking official at a desk somewhere in the core worlds. Kevin explained everything. The albino dragons, the parasitic infection, the illegal mining operation poisoning their water. He sent files, images, medical scans, geological surveys. He spoke with urgency and passion, trying to make the official understand how critical this was. The official listened with a blank expression, occasionally glancing at something off-screen. When Kevin finished, there was a long pause. Then the official spoke in a flat, disinterested voice. Albino dragons were not listed in the protected species database. There had been no confirmed sightings in over 200 years. The species was considered extinct, which meant they had no legal protection. Without legal protection, the Conservation Authority could not intervene. Kevin argued. He sent more images, showed live video feed of the dragons outside his station. The official barely looked. The regulations were clear. Extinct species could not be protected. If Kevin wanted to file a petition to have them reinstated, he could submit the proper forms and wait for review. The review process typically took 18 to 24 months. The juveniles would be dead in 2 months, maybe 3. Kevin felt rage building in his chest, hot and fierce. He demanded to speak to a supervisor. The official said all supervisors were in meetings. He asked for emergency intervention. The official said there was no emergency classification for extinct species. He begged. He pleaded. He explained that living, breathing, intelligent creatures were dying right now at this moment while they talked. The official ended the call. Kevin sat in silence, staring at the blank screen. Around him, the monitoring equipment beeped softly, tracking the vital signs of 3 dying juveniles. Outside the windows, 11 adult dragons waited, trusting him to save their children. And the galaxy, the vast bureaucratic machine that was supposed to protect life, had turned its back. He looked at the tissue samples on his workbench, at the analysis screens showing the progression of the infection, at the pile of medicinal plants the dragons had brought him. The matriarch appeared at the window, her golden eyes meeting his through the glass. She tilted her head, a gesture he now recognized as a question. "Can you help them?" Kevin stood up and placed his hand against the window. The matriarch pressed her snout against the glass from the other side, as close to touching as they could get with the barrier between them. He did not need officials. He did not need the conservation authority. He had his training, his equipment, and his determination. He would save these juveniles. He would cure this infection. And he would do it alone if he had to, because sometimes the right thing to do had nothing to do with regulations or bureaucracy. Sometimes it was just about one person choosing to help another living being in need. The dragons had trusted him against all odds. Now he had to prove that their trust was not misplaced. Kevin had not slept in 72 hours. His eyes burned with exhaustion, and his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the molecular synthesizer for the 19th time. Empty coffee cups littered his workstation, and the floor was covered with discarded notes and failed formula calculations. But he could not stop. Would not stop. 3 young lives depended on him. The parasites were incredibly resilient. Every treatment Kevin tried they adapted to within hours. He had used standard antiparasitic compounds first, the ones that worked on 90% of known organisms. The parasites ignored them completely. He tried targeted enzyme disruptors next, carefully designed to break down the mineral bonds holding the colonies together. The parasites simply reformed in a different configuration. Kevin slumped in his chair, frustration making his chest tight. Through the window, he could see the matriarch lying near the cargo bay, her eyes never leaving the spot where her juveniles rested inside. She had not moved in 2 days except to drink water. The other dragons took turns bringing her food, but she barely ate. She was waiting, trusting, hoping. He could not fail her. Kevin rubbed his burning eyes and forced himself to think differently. He was approaching this like a xenobiologist, using treatments designed for alien organisms. But what if he thought like a farmer instead? He had grown up on Earth, on his family's livestock farm in rural Scotland. He had spent his childhood helping his father treat sick cattle, sheep, and horses. Simple Earth animals with simple Earth parasites. He remembered one particular summer when their whole herd of cattle got infected with liver flukes, parasites that formed calcified cysts in the animals' organs. The veterinary medicines had not worked fast enough, and they were losing animals every day. His father had tried something desperate, an old remedy passed down from his grandfather. A compound derived from white willow bark, combined with a specific enzyme found in fermented milk. It had worked. The calcifications dissolved and the cattle recovered. Kevin sat up straight, his exhausted mind suddenly racing. The dragon parasites formed mineral-based colonies, just like liver flukes formed calcified cysts. What if the same principle applied? He pulled up his database of Earth compounds and started searching. White willow bark contained salicylic acid, a natural anti-inflammatory that also happened to dissolve certain types of mineral deposits. The enzyme from fermented milk was more complex, but its basic function was to break down proteins that bonded minerals together. He had neither white willow bark nor fermented milk here on Petra Station. But he had something better. He had a fully equipped chemistry lab and the ability to synthesize almost any organic compound. Kevin began working with renewed energy, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he designed a new formula. Synthetic salicylic acid combined with a modified enzyme chain that mimicked the properties of the milk compound, adjusted for the dragon's silicon-based biology instead of Earth's carbon-based life. The synthesizer hummed to life, its internal mechanisms sorting through thousands of molecular components. It would take 6 hours to produce enough of the compound for a single dose. Kevin used that time to run simulations, testing the formula against samples of the parasites in controlled environments. The computer models looked promising. The salicylic acid should weaken the mineral bonds while the enzyme broke down the protein structures. Together they might actually work. When the synthesizer finally chimed completion, Kevin carefully extracted the pale blue liquid into a medical injector. His hands were steady now, focused by purpose. He walked into the cargo bay where the 3 juveniles lay on padded mats he had arranged for them. They looked worse than 3 days ago. The purple crystals had spread further, covering almost 70% of the smallest one's body. Its breathing was shallow and labored. The matriarch appeared at the window immediately, her golden eyes locked on Kevin and the injector in his hand. He held it up so she could see, then pointed to the smallest juvenile. The matriarch made a low, rumbling sound. Kevin chose to interpret it as permission. He knelt beside the smallest dragon and spoke softly to it, the same soothing tone he had used with frightened cattle back home. The juvenile's eyes opened, dim with pain and fever. Kevin gently inserted the injector against a patch of clear scales on its neck and administered the dose. The dragon flinched but did not pull away. Now came the hardest part. Waiting. Kevin sat on the floor beside the juvenile, monitoring its vital signs on his portable scanner. The matriarch never left the window. 1 hour passed. 2 hours. The dragon's temperature began to drop slightly, a good sign. 3 hours. Kevin thought he saw the purple crystals looking less vibrant, but it might have been wishful thinking. 4 hours. Then it happened. A small piece of crystal on the dragon's foreleg cracked and fell off, crumbling into powder when it hit the floor. Kevin leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe. Another piece cracked. Then another. The parasites were dying, their mineral structures collapsing without the protein bonds to hold them together. By the next morning, the smallest juvenile was 50% clear. Kevin immediately prepared doses for the other 2 and administered them before he allowed himself to feel hope. He had been disappointed too many times already. But as the day progressed, all 3 juveniles began to improve. The crystals cracked and fell away like old scabs, revealing healthy white scales underneath. The matriarch saw it happening. Kevin watched her reaction through the window, saw the exact moment when hope turned into belief. She raised her head high and made a sound unlike anything Kevin had heard before. It was loud, triumphant, a cry of pure joy that echoed across the mountains. The other dragons answered immediately, their voices joining hers in a chorus that shook the station's walls. Kevin treated the juveniles 3 times a day for the next week, carefully monitoring their recovery. The parasites were stubborn, and he had to adjust the formula twice to catch colonies that had embedded deeper in the tissue. But slowly, steadily, the 3 young dragons healed. Their scales regained their brilliant white shine. Their eyes grew bright and alert again. They started eating, started moving around the cargo bay, started playing with each other like healthy children should. On the 8th day, Kevin opened the cargo bay doors and let them outside. The smallest one was hesitant, staying close to Kevin's side. He placed his hand on its neck, and it made a happy chirping sound before running to its mother. The matriarch lowered her great head and nuzzled each juvenile carefully, checking them with her eyes and nose and gentle touch. Then she looked at Kevin. She approached him slowly, and for a moment Kevin felt a spike of fear. She was enormous, powerful enough to crush him without effort. But she stopped just in front of him and lowered her head until her snout touched his chest, the same gesture of trust she had shown on that first day. Kevin reached up and placed both hands on her scaled face, feeling the warmth of her breath, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat through her skin. The dragons changed after that. They brought Kevin food, fresh meat from mountain animals they had hunted. He tried to refuse at first, explaining he had his own supplies, but the matriarch insisted, leaving the offerings at his door every morning. They stood guard around the station at night, taking shifts so that at least 3 adults were always awake and watching. Kevin felt safer than he ever had, protected by creatures who had once been strangers. But the most remarkable change came in the evenings. As the sun set and the stars appeared in the darkening sky, the dragons would gather in a circle around the station and sing. Kevin had no other word for it. They made low, rumbling sounds that resonated in complex harmonies, rising and falling in patterns that felt almost like music. Each dragon had a different tone, a different pitch, and together they created something beautiful and ancient. Kevin would sit outside on those evenings, wrapped in his thermal coat, listening to the dragon songs. The juveniles joined in too, their higher voices weaving through the deeper tones of the adults. It was gratitude Kevin understood. It was their way of saying thank you, of showing appreciation for a human who had saved their children when no one else would help. Sometimes the matriarch would pause in her singing and look at Kevin, and he would see something profound in those golden eyes. Respect. Friendship. Trust that had been tested and proven true. He had given her back her children. He had worked himself to exhaustion, had refused to give up even when every attempt failed, had trusted his instincts and his knowledge to find a solution where none seemed to exist. That was the human way, Kevin thought. Humans did not always have the best technology or the most advanced science. But they had determination. They had compassion. They had the willingness to keep trying when others would have walked away. And sometimes that made all the difference. The matriarch woke Kevin before dawn on the 10th day. She tapped on his bedroom window with one careful claw, the sound gentle but insistent. Kevin dressed quickly and went outside, his breath forming clouds in the cold mountain air. The matriarch waited for him, her body tense with purpose. She lowered her shoulder and looked back at him, her meaning unmistakable. She wanted him to ride. Kevin had never ridden a dragon before. He had never even imagined such a thing was possible. But he understood this was important, that she needed to show him something that could not wait. He climbed onto her back, settling between two ridged scales near her shoulders and gripping tightly with his legs. Her scales were warm despite the freezing air, and he could feel the powerful muscles shifting beneath him. The matriarch launched into the sky with a single powerful leap. Kevin's stomach dropped as the ground fell away beneath them. The station became a small gray dot, then disappeared entirely as they climbed higher into the mountains. Other dragons joined them, flying in formation around their leader. They were heading north, toward the tallest peaks where the snow never melted. They flew for nearly an hour. Kevin had seen these mountains from the ground, had studied their geology and mapped their mineral deposits, but seeing them from above was different. They were vast and ancient, their peaks sharp as broken teeth against the pale sky. Glaciers carved through the valleys and deep canyons split the rock like open wounds. The matriarch began to descend, angling toward a wide plateau nestled between two peaks. As they drew closer, Kevin could see structures below. Dozens of them, carefully built from stones and arranged in a protective circle. This was the dragon nesting ground, the place where they had lived for generations. They landed on the plateau and Kevin slid off the matriarch's back. The wind was fierce up here, howling between the peaks and carrying sharp crystals of ice. But the dragons seemed unbothered, moving among their nests with familiar ease. The matriarch led Kevin to the center of the circle, to a natural spring that bubbled up from deep underground. The water was wrong. Kevin could see it immediately. The spring should have been crystal clear, pure mountain water filtered through miles of ancient stone. Instead, it was cloudy with a strange purple tint that he recognized instantly. The same purple as the parasites that had infected the juveniles. This was the source. This was where the contamination began. Kevin pulled a sample container from his pocket and collected water from the spring. The matriarch watched him work, then moved to the edge of the plateau and looked down. Kevin followed her gaze and felt anger surge through him like electricity. Below them, carved into the side of the mountain, was a massive mining operation. Huge machines tore into the rock, extracting ore and leaving behind gaping holes. Conveyor belts carried material to processing plants where it was crushed and sorted. And from those processing plants, thick pipes ran down the mountain, disappearing into the rock face. Kevin understood immediately. They were pumping wastewater deep into the mountain, into the underground cave systems where it mixed with the natural springs. The poisoned water then flowed up here to the dragon nesting grounds. The Vrecklin Corporation logo was painted on every building, every machine, every vehicle. They knew exactly where they were. This plateau was marked on every map as a protected zone, set aside decades ago when people still believed albino dragons might exist. But protected zone laws meant nothing if no one was alive to enforce them. The matriarch made a low, mournful sound. She walked to one of the nests at the edge of the circle and Kevin followed. The nest was empty, but it showed signs of recent use. Dried blood stained the stones. Long black scorch marks streaked across the rock. Kevin knelt down and examined the marks more closely. They were burns from plasma weapons, the kind used by corporate security forces. Kevin looked up at the matriarch and saw 3 long scars running across her side, partially hidden beneath her scales. Burn scars. Old enough to have healed but recent enough to still show clearly. He stood and moved among the other dragons, really looking at them for the first time. Every adult bore scars. Slash marks from blades. Impact craters from projectile weapons. Chemical burns. These dragons had been attacked, repeatedly and violently. The matriarch led him to another nest, then another. 5 nests total stood empty with blood and burn marks telling their story. Kevin counted them carefully, documenting everything with his camera. 5 dragons had died here, killed while defending their home. The mining crews had not just poisoned the water. They had actively hunted the dragons, trying to drive them away or eliminate them entirely. Kevin felt sick. He pulled out his portable scanner and began taking readings of everything. The contaminated spring, the scorch marks, the weapons residue still present in some of the burn patterns. He photographed every empty nest, every scar on every dragon. He recorded video of the mining operation below, zooming in to capture the waste pipes clearly violating environmental protocols. This was not just negligence. This was deliberate. The Vreklin Corporation knew dragons were here. They had to know. You could not kill 5 of them without realizing what you were doing. They had chosen to continue anyway, chosen to poison the water and attack the creatures who lived here, all for the valuable metals buried in the mountain. The matriarch sat down beside Kevin as he worked, her golden eyes watching him carefully. He understood now why she had brought her herd to him that first day. The healing was important, yes. The juveniles needed to be saved. But this was bigger than sickness. This was about survival. The dragons could move to new nesting grounds, could find clean water elsewhere in the mountains. But moving meant abandoning their ancestral home, meant letting the corporation win, meant accepting that their lives mattered less than corporate profits. The dragons had sought him out because they needed more than medicine. They needed justice. They needed someone who could speak to the human world, who could document what was happening and make others listen. The matriarch had chosen to trust a human to stand against other humans, betting everything on the hope that not all humans were destroyers. Kevin looked at the empty nests, at the contaminated spring, at the massive mining operation tearing into the mountain. He thought about the board official who had dismissed his call, about the bureaucracy that declared these magnificent creatures legally extinct while they lived and died and fought for their home. He thought about the Vreklin Corporation executives in their comfortable offices, making decisions that poisoned water and killed children and destroyed homes, all for profit margins and quarterly reports. Something hard and determined settled in Kevin's chest. He had saved 3 juveniles from parasitic infection. That was good, but it was not enough. If he did nothing else, the mining would continue. More dragons would get sick. More would be killed. Eventually, the herd would be forced to leave or die, and albino dragons really would go extinct, this time forever. The matriarch nudged his shoulder gently with her snout. Kevin turned and met her eyes. In them he saw pain from lost herd members, fear for her remaining family, and underneath it all, hope. Hope that he would help. Hope that one human with a camera and documentation and righteous anger could make a difference. Kevin reached up and placed his hand on the matriarch's scarred face. He made a promise in that moment, standing on an ancient nesting ground surrounded by evidence of corporate violence. He would not let this stand. He would find a way to stop Vreklin, to shut down their operation, to bring justice for the 5 dragons who had died defending their home. He did not know how yet, did not have a plan, but he would figure it out. The dragons had trusted him against all odds. They had brought him their sick children and watched him save them. They had shown him their scars and their losses, had revealed their deepest pain. They believed in him. Kevin would not let that belief be misplaced. He would fight for them the way they had fought for their home. And if the galaxy would not listen to reason, would not respond to documentation and evidence and appeals to basic decency, then he would find another way. Because sometimes doing the right thing meant standing up to power, meant risking everything, meant refusing to accept that profit mattered more than lives. The matriarch made a soft sound, almost like a sigh of relief. She understood. Somehow, across the barrier of species and language, she understood that Kevin had committed himself to their cause. They were no longer alone in this fight. Kevin spent 2 days planning his approach. He needed clear evidence of Vreklin's crimes, footage that could not be dismissed or ignored. The documentation from the nesting grounds was good, but it was not enough. He needed to show the mining operation in action, needed to catch them actively dumping waste into the water systems, needed proof so overwhelming that even the most corrupt official could not look away. The problem was security. Vreklin had sensors and cameras covering every approach to their facility. Ground access was impossible. The only way to get close enough for detailed footage was from the air, and the only aircraft Kevin had access to were living ones. The matriarch seemed to understand what he needed before he even explained it. When Kevin showed her his camera equipment and pointed toward the mining operation, she lowered her shoulder immediately. They would go together, at night when darkness provided cover and the mining crews worked under bright artificial lights that would show up perfectly on camera. Kevin prepared carefully. He strapped his recording equipment to his chest, added a backup camera to his belt, and loaded every data chip he owned. He wore dark clothing to blend with the night sky and secured himself to the matriarch's back with a climbing harness modified to fit around her neck ridge. If they had to maneuver quickly, he did not want to fall. They left 2 hours after sunset. The moon was only a thin crescent, providing minimal light. Perfect for staying hidden. The matriarch flew low, using the terrain to mask their approach, with 4 other adult dragons following silently behind. Kevin felt the wind rushing past his face, cold and sharp as they glided between mountain peaks. The mining operation blazed with light when they crested the final ridge. Massive floodlights illuminated the entire site, turning night into artificial day. Kevin could see everything clearly. The drilling machines tearing into the mountain. The processing plants crushing ore. And most importantly, the waste pipes actively pumping purple-tinted water into boreholes that led deep underground. Kevin started recording. The matriarch made slow, careful passes around the facility while he captured everything from multiple angles. He zoomed in on corporate logos, on equipment serial numbers, on the contaminated water flowing freely from the pipes. This was exactly what he needed. Evidence so clear that even Vreklin could not deny it. They made 3 complete circuits of the facility. Kevin was reviewing his footage, making sure he had everything, when alarms began blaring across the mining site. Red warning lights flashed in patterns. He had been spotted. The matriarch reacted instantly, banking hard to the left as a bright beam of light locked onto them. A searchlight, powerful enough to turn the night sky bright as noon. Kevin heard a sharp crack and saw a tracer round zip past them, close enough that he felt the heat of its passage. They were shooting at them. More weapons opened fire. Not just small arms but heavy guns mounted on the facility's perimeter towers. The other dragons scattered, trying to draw fire away from the matriarch and Kevin. Explosions lit up the sky as flak rounds detonated, filling the air with deadly shrapnel. The matriarch dove, dropping altitude so fast that Kevin's stomach lurched. She wove between rock formations, using the mountains for cover, but the searchlights followed them relentlessly. Kevin felt impacts against her scales, heard her grunt of pain as bullets found their mark. She was getting hit. They were both going to die if they did not get out of range. But Kevin's mind was racing ahead to the next problem. He had the evidence now, but it meant nothing if he could not share it. Vreklin would hunt him down, would destroy the recordings, would kill him and the dragons to protect their illegal operation. He needed to broadcast everything immediately, needed to get it out to the entire galaxy before they could be silenced. He shouted to the matriarch over the wind and gunfire, pointing back toward Petra Station. She understood and changed course, arrowing through the darkness with desperate speed. The other dragons formed up around them, putting their bodies between Kevin and the guns below. He saw one dragon take a direct hit, saw it tumble briefly before recovering and continuing to fly. They were protecting him with their lives. They reached Petra Station in minutes that felt like hours. The matriarch landed hard on the pad, her legs buckling slightly from exhaustion and pain. Kevin jumped off her back and ran for the communication room, his fingers already pulling data chips from his cameras. Behind him, he heard the dragons taking defensive positions around the station. They knew what was coming. Vreklin would not let them escape. Kevin's hands shook as he loaded the footage into his communication system. He had to do this right. Broadcasting on standard channels would not work. Vreklin could jam those, could intercept the signal, could stop the transmission before anyone saw it. He needed to use the emergency broadcast system, the one reserved for disasters and distress calls. It transmitted on every frequency simultaneously, bounced the signal off every relay satellite in the sector, made it impossible to block completely. Using the emergency system without authorization was illegal. Kevin would lose his license, would probably face criminal charges, might end up in prison. But looking at the footage on his screen, at the evidence of environmental destruction and attempted murder, he did not hesitate. Some laws deserved to be broken. He activated the emergency broadcast and uploaded everything. Video of the contaminated water. Images of the empty nests and weapon scars. Recordings of the mining operation. Documentation of protected zone violations. Medical scans showing the parasitic infections. And a message, recorded quickly but spoken with absolute conviction, explaining everything that Vreklin had done. The transmission began, data streaming out across the galaxy at the speed of light. It would take hours to reach the core worlds, but it was unstoppable now. Kevin had made sure of that by routing it through 30 different relay stations. Even if Vreklin destroyed Petra Station, even if they killed everyone here, the evidence would survive. Lights appeared in the darkness outside. Vehicles approaching fast from the direction of the mining facility. Kevin counted 6 of them, heavy transport trucks modified for combat. Mercenaries. Vreklin had sent their private security force to eliminate the problem permanently. The dragons saw them coming. The matriarch roared, a sound of challenge and defiance that echoed across the mountains. The herd responded, taking positions around the station in a defensive circle. 11 dragons against 6 trucks full of armed mercenaries. The dragons were outnumbered, outgunned, injured from the earlier fight. They should have fled, should have saved themselves. But they did not move. Kevin watched from the window, his heart in his throat, as the first truck opened fire. Heavy machine guns tore into the night, tracers painting bright lines through the darkness. The dragons met the attack head-on. They breathed gouts of superheated air that melted gun barrels and forced mercenaries to take cover. They used their tails like battering rams, smashing into vehicle armor. They fought with claws and teeth and wings, turning the area around Petra Station into a war zone. The battle was chaos. Kevin could barely track what was happening. He saw one dragon take a rocket to the shoulder and keep fighting. Saw another grab a mercenary's weapon in its jaws and crush it to scrap metal. Saw the matriarch stand directly in front of the station's main entrance, refusing to let anyone pass, taking hit after hit on her scarred hide. They were protecting him. These magnificent creatures who had come to him for help, who had trusted him with their children, were now dying to keep him safe. Kevin felt tears burning in his eyes. He wanted to run outside, wanted to tell them to flee and save themselves, but he knew they would not listen. They had made their choice. The broadcast was still transmitting. Kevin watched the progress bar crawl toward completion while outside the dragons fought desperately against overwhelming odds. 70% uploaded. 80%. A dragon screamed in pain as a mercenary's blade found soft tissue under its wing. 90%. The matriarch was bleeding from a dozen wounds now, her white scales stained dark. But she held her position, roaring defiance at the mercenaries who tried repeatedly to push past her. She had lost herd members to these same weapons, had watched her home be poisoned, had nearly lost her children. She would not lose Kevin too. 100%. The transmission completed, spreading across the galaxy in an unstoppable wave of evidence and accusation. Kevin activated the station's external speakers and shouted to the dragons. He told them it was done, told them the evidence was safe, told them they could retreat now. The matriarch looked back at him through the window, her golden eyes bright with pain and determination. She roared again, and this time it sounded like victory. The sky was beginning to lighten when the ships arrived. Kevin saw them first on his sensors, 3 large vessels dropping out of hyperspace and entering the planet's atmosphere. For a terrible moment he thought they were Vreklin reinforcements, that more mercenaries were coming to finish what the first group had started. But then he saw the markings on their hulls and felt hope surge through his exhausted body. Galactic Conservation Authority. Official ships bearing the green and blue insignia of Species Protection Services. The mercenaries saw them too. Their attack faltered as the GCA ships descended, powerful searchlights illuminating the battlefield. The dragons were battered and bleeding, several barely able to stand, but they had held. They had kept Kevin safe through the entire night, and now help was finally arriving. A booming voice came over external speakers, amplified to carry across the entire area. This was an official Conservation Authority operation. All Vreklin personnel were to cease hostilities immediately and surrender their weapons. Failure to comply would result in prosecution for attacking a protected zone and endangered species. The mercenaries looked at each other uncertainly. They were corporate security, not soldiers. They had signed up for intimidation and light enforcement, not a fight against government forces. One by one they lowered their weapons and raised their hands. The battle was over. Kevin ran outside, stumbling in his exhaustion. The matriarch stood near the station entrance, swaying on her feet. Blood dripped from wounds across her body. But when she saw Kevin, she made a soft rumbling sound that he had come to recognize as relief. He walked to her and placed both hands on her snout, feeling hot tears running down his face. She had almost died for him. They all had. GCA officers swarmed the area, taking mercenaries into custody and setting up medical stations. A middle-aged woman with commander's insignia approached Kevin, her expression a mixture of shock and admiration. She introduced herself as Commander Sarah Mills and explained that his emergency broadcast had reached GCA headquarters 4 hours ago. The moment they saw the footage, they mobilized every available ship. The evidence Kevin had gathered was spreading across the galactic network like wildfire. News agencies were picking it up, broadcasting it to billions of viewers. Social media was exploding with outrage. People across hundreds of worlds were watching footage of albino dragons, creatures thought extinct, being poisoned and shot at by corporate mercenaries. The public reaction was instant and furious. Commander Mills had medical teams treat the dragons first, before even looking at the human injuries. Veterinary specialists worked carefully on the wounded herd members, closing wounds and administering pain medication designed for large reptilian species. The dragons accepted the treatment calmly, seeming to understand these humans were trying to help. The smallest juvenile, the first one Kevin had cured, approached Commander Mills and chirped at her softly. She stared at it in wonder, reaching out slowly to touch its scales. The dragon leaned into her hand like a cat seeking affection. Mills looked at Kevin with tears in her eyes and whispered that she had never imagined she would see such creatures in her lifetime. More ships arrived as morning progressed. Media vessels wanting footage. Science teams eager to study and document. And finally, the Enforcement Division of the Galactic Environmental Protection Agency. They descended on the Vreklin mining facility like an avenging storm, shutting down every operation and placing the entire site under legal quarantine. Vreklin executives tried to fight back at first, issuing statements about property rights and claiming they had no knowledge of dragons in the area. But Kevin's footage showed their waste pipes poisoning the water. Showed their security forces actively shooting at protected species. Showed equipment serial numbers and corporate logos on every piece of illegal machinery. There was no denying it, no legal maneuvering that could make this go away. Within 24 hours, Vreklin's stock price collapsed. Within 48 hours, their CEO resigned in disgrace. Within a week, the corporation filed for bankruptcy, destroyed by lawsuits and criminal charges and complete loss of public trust. But the impact went far beyond one company's downfall. Kevin's broadcast had sparked something larger, a galaxy-wide conversation about corporate accountability and environmental protection. People were asking how a corporation could operate illegally in a protected zone for months without oversight. How a species could be declared extinct while they still lived and breathed and fought for their homes. The Galactic Council called emergency sessions. New laws were proposed. Enforcement agencies received increased funding and expanded authority. And at the center of it all was the image of albino dragons standing in a defensive circle around a small research station, protecting the human who had protected them. The formal recognition came 3 weeks later. Kevin stood in the central plaza of Petra Station, which had been expanded and reinforced to accommodate the influx of scientists and observers. Commander Mills read the official declaration in front of hundreds of witnesses and dozens of cameras broadcasting to the entire galaxy. Albino dragons were recognized as a protected sentient species with full rights under galactic conservation law. Their nesting grounds were designated as a permanent sanctuary. Any harm to them or their habitat would be prosecuted as a criminal offense. And in an unprecedented move, the dragons were granted legal representation, with Kevin Walsh named as their official advocate and liaison. The matriarch stood beside Kevin during the ceremony, her wounds healed and her scales gleaming brilliant white in the sunlight. When Commander Mills finished reading the declaration, the matriarch raised her head and sang. The other dragons joined her, their voices rising in harmonies that made everyone present fall silent in awe. The ceremony was broadcast across the galaxy. Billions watched as the dragons sang and a human stood among them, not as their master or their conqueror, but as their friend. It became the defining image of a movement, proof that different species could coexist, could trust each other, could build something better together. In the months that followed, Petra Station transformed into something entirely new. It was no longer just a research outpost but a symbol of interspecies cooperation. Scientists came to study the dragons with their permission, learning their language and their culture. Conservationists used it as a model for protecting other endangered species. And people from across the galaxy came simply to see the dragons, to witness the bond between human and dragon that had sparked a revolution. The herd chose to stay. They could have gone anywhere, could have returned to complete isolation in the deepest mountains. But they remained close to the station, building new nests on the plateau nearby. The juveniles, now healthy and growing strong, played in the snow while their parents watched protectively. They had found safety here, had found allies, and they were not leaving. Kevin's life changed in ways he never anticipated. He received awards and honors from a dozen different governments. Universities offered him prestigious positions. But he stayed at Petra Station, continuing his work as the dragon's advocate. He learned their language more deeply, discovering they had poetry and history and philosophy that stretched back thousands of years. He taught them about human culture in return, about art and music and the strange ways humans organized their societies. The matriarch became his closest companion. They would sit together in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Sometimes they talked, Kevin speaking in human words and dragon gestures while she responded in her own language. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, two very different beings who had learned to trust each other completely. Other species began seeking human mediators for their own conservation efforts. Kevin's success had proven something important. Humans had a unique capacity for cross-species empathy, a willingness to fight for creatures who could not fight for themselves. It became part of humanity's reputation across the galaxy, a source of pride and responsibility. One evening, nearly a year after that first desperate morning when 12 dragons had appeared at his station, Kevin sat with the matriarch on the plateau. The 3 juveniles he had saved were now adolescents, practicing flight patterns with the other young dragons. The herd had grown too, with 2 new clutches of eggs hatching successfully in the cleaned, protected nesting grounds. The matriarch made a contemplative sound and looked at Kevin with those wise golden eyes. He thought about everything that had happened, about how close they had all come to disaster, about the trust that had been offered and repaid. About how one person choosing to help, choosing to care, choosing to stand up against injustice had changed everything. Kevin reached out and placed his hand on the matriarch's scarred face, feeling the warmth of her scales beneath his palm. She leaned into his touch and made a sound like a sigh of contentment. Around them, the herd continued their evening songs, filling the mountain air with music that celebrated survival, friendship, and hope. The dragons had trusted a human against all odds. And that trust had been rewarded with a future neither species would face alone.